Good evening, everybody. Good evening. Welcome to Birkbeck and welcome to the Birkbeck Institute for the Study of Antisemitism. My name is Brendan McGeever and I'm the co-director of the Birkbeck Institute. I'm delighted to welcome you all this evening to this Holocaust Memorial Day lecture, which is organised by the Birkbeck Institute in collaboration with the Institute of Historical Research. This collaboration, I just learned, is as old as the Birkbeck Institute itself. Since our founding year, back in 2010-2011, we have held an annual Holocaust Memorial Day lecture in partnership with the Institute of Historical Research. And it's a partnership that means a great deal to us and one that we are delighted to be part of. The plan of action this evening is going to run something like this. We'll have a public lecture and then afterwards, Professor Claire Langhammer, Director of the Institute of Historical Research, will then chair the discussion between our speaker and all of you who've come out in such great numbers this evening. And it's usually at this exact moment when I say something about how much of a great pleasure it is to welcome our speaker. And truly, it is a tremendous pleasure. But tonight is a little bit different than usual. Because this evening, our speaker is Professor David Feldman, Professor of History at Birkbeck, University of London, where he's also the director of the Birkbeck Institute for the Study of Antisemitism. And he's also a Professor of History of Antisemitism at the University of Melbourne. David's scholarship on antisemitism is world-renowned. In addition to being a world-leading scholar of antisemitism, he's also one of the most humble scholars. So I'm pleased to have a minute or two tonight to just say a couple of words about him and about his work. David's most recent book, co-edited with Mark Wolovici, is Antisemitism, Islamophobia and the Politics of Definition, published by Palgrave in 2023. He's the co-author of Facing Antisemitism, The Struggle for Safety and Solidarity, a report on antisemitism in Britain today, published by the Runnymede Trust in January just last year. His writing has appeared in a wide range of outlets, including The Guardian, The Financial Times, Haaretz, The New Statesman, The Independent, The Political Quarterly, and major publications in the United States and in other countries as well. His forthcoming book on antisemitism will be one that is field-defining. The field of antisemitism studies is one that presents challenges and complex problems, as I think everybody here is well aware. Through his scholarship, David meets those challenges with compassion, with clarity, with utterly consistent principles, and of course, with unrivaled intellect. Whenever David offers his voice, we all learn. And indeed, the greatest privilege I've had in academia over the last decade or so has been to be one of those people who gets to learn from David. It's not just students and his colleagues who benefit from his scholarship. Organisations around the world seek out his voice, including, just to name a couple, the United Nations, the Victoria and Albert Museum, the Jewish Museum, the Football Association, and many more. Hopefully one day Arsenal, his beloved Arsenal, will also seek out his voice. How lucky we are then tonight to welcome David to give this Holocaust Memorial Day lecture, which is titled Mourning, Memory and Politics, Memorialization of the Holocaust in Britain from the 1940s to the present day. In this lecture, David will teach us about how memorialization of the Holocaust has changed over time, why it has changed over time, and the role of Holocaust memorialization today. A topic we can all agree that is of great significance. So please join me in welcoming Professor David Feldman to give this year's Holocaust Memorial Day lecture.
Good evening. It's customary to begin by thanking the chair of the evening for their kind and generous remarks, but I'm frankly moved and staggered by Brendan's introduction and hugely grateful. On the 25th of May, 1943, on page 3, the Times reported on what it called a pogrom in the Warsaw Ghetto. In the eyes of the newspaper's editorial staff, the event was newsworthy but held no special significance. They placed the report below news about Mahatma Gandhi and other Congress leaders imprisoned in India, and beneath items dealing with railway construction in North Africa and the celebration of Empire Day in Egypt and Australia. Nevertheless, the Times here revealed the substance of 2 letters received in London and signed on behalf of the Central Committee of Jewish Labour, the Bund, and by the Jewish National Committee in Poland. The letters recorded that 40,000 Jews remained in Warsaw, a city which in 1939 had contained a Jewish population of more than 350,000. The first letter, dated the 28th of April 1943, chronicled, "Today is the 9th day that the ghetto fights back." Jewish combatants had set alight stores and factories. They had killed and wounded 1,000 of the enemy. The SS and Wehrmacht employed high explosive and incendiary bombs and blasted blocks of houses where there was resistance. The letter continued, "Men, women, and children who are not burnt alive are murdered en masse." The second letter, written on the 11th of May, recorded that resistance was nearing its end. Within days, the revolt had been overpowered. A few of the remaining Jews escaped to the Aryan side of Warsaw. Most were murdered in camps. Commemoration of these events did not await defeat of the Third Reich. Just 1 year later, there were synagogue services across Britain to remember what was called the Warsaw Ghetto Battle. In London, speakers at a meeting in Holborn, organised by the Bund, invoked the class solidarity of Polish and Jewish workers. They also presented Jewish resistance as a component of Polish patriotism. Emanuel Scherer, a representative of the Bund on the Polish National Council, said that the fighters in the Warsaw Ghetto went to the battle to defend their Warsaw and their soil. At Bevis Marks Synagogue in the City of London, the chief rabbi, Joseph Hertz, a long-standing Zionist, delivered a different message. He placed the Battle of Warsaw in the longue durée of Jewish history and suffering, which recalled the glory of the Maccabees and the self-slaughter at Masada. In Hertz's account, the martyrs at Warsaw did not die for a socialist future in Poland, but for the honor of their people, the Jewish people. He went on to draw attention to the indifference of the larger public, who remain unmoved by this mass crucifixion of a whole people. Hertz excoriated the silence of the leaders of British Jewry, chastising them for their reluctance to protest publicly against what he said was a cataclysm that threatened to engulf half the Jewish race. I want to draw out 3 points from this episode. First, in 1943-44, the mass murder of Europe's Jews had not yet been isolated as a discrete unit of history, let alone an event invested with unique moral and historical significance. The terms Churban, Holocaust, and Shoah, the words employed in post-war decades in Yiddish, English, and Hebrew to encapsulate the campaign of persecution and mass murder had not yet achieved widespread currency. Instead, we find people struggling to find words and concepts to capture the unfolding horror. When Hertz referred to a crucifixion of a whole people, he drew from a vocabulary most associated with the founding moment of Christianity. The Times wrote about a pogrom, a term that falls short, not least because we associate it with popular violence, not the orchestrated force of state power. My second point is that from the very beginning, the question of how to understand the persecution and murder of Jews was divisive. Should British Jews promote awareness of the dire situation of European Jewry, or should they keep silent and devote themselves to the Allied cause? Was the resistance in Warsaw a Polish story or a Jewish story? Did it confirm the imperative to struggle for a socialist future in Poland or a Zionist future in Palestine? The contention we encounter today between universalist and particular perspectives on the meaning of the Holocaust, and which has infused public debate so forcefully since the 7th of October 2023, has its origins in the early 1940s. Third, seen from the vantage point of the present, this episode highlights that we are dealing with a history of change. Today, the Holocaust occupies a prominent place in public discourse and in the minds of British political leaders. The Conservative, Labour and Liberal Democrat political parties are all committed to building a Holocaust Memorial and Learning Centre on land next to the Houses of Parliament. The British government funds visits to Poland in the expectation that school children will learn lessons from Auschwitz. And lessons from Auschwitz means lessons from the Holocaust. Industrial slaughter at the most notorious of all the Nazi camps is used in everyday speech to represent the Nazis' war against the Jews as a whole. Finally, Holocaust survivors are given a special function in promoting Holocaust consciousness and memorialization. It was not always like this. It is only since the 1980s and 90s that survivors and survivor testimony have become central to our understanding of the history of the Holocaust and to its memorialization. In the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, it was not Auschwitz, but the resistance of Jews in Warsaw that stood at the center of Holocaust memorialization. Above all, the great moral and political significance of the Holocaust in British public culture is an innovation that dates only to the end of the 20th century. In the remainder of this talk, I want to focus on how our conception of the campaign of persecution and murder aimed at Europe's Jews has changed in the post-war decades, and with what consequences for our capacity to understand the past and to contribute to a better future and to live up to the maxim, never again. In the 1950s, memorialization of the Holocaust by British Jews was fragmented and inward-looking. In 1953, the 10th anniversary of the Warsaw Ghetto uprising, there were 4 separate commemorative events in London, organized by the Polish Jewish Ex-Servicemen's Association, the Friends of Yiddish, by Poalet Zion, and by the Jewish Socialist Organization of Great Britain. These were occasions designed to remember the heroism of Jewish resistance fighters and the martyrdom of millions. They also provided moments to mourn, to express ideological convictions, and to voice grievances. In 1954, the chairman of the British Zionist Federation set forward a vision of historical change at scale, in which the Jewish rising in Warsaw, he said, marked the end of the era of Churban, destruction, just as Israel's Independence Day, he said, marked the beginning of a new period in Jewish life. In 1959, speaking in Yiddish, Shmuel Levenberg, a veteran Labour Zionist, reproached Western Jewry for not taking part in the commemoration. He questioned accusingly, where are the official representatives of English Jewry? Where is the English youth? In the early 1960s, commemoration underwent far-reaching change. The foundations for this were laid inadvertently in Israel. In 1959, the Knesset passed a law for a day of remembrance of Holocaust and heroism on the 27th day of Nisan in the Jewish calendar, a date close to the final phase of resistance in Warsaw. Without intending to do so, Israel's legislators paved the way for new commemorative initiatives outside of the country. The second way in which Israel created conditions for a new sort of memorialization in Britain was through the capture of Adolf Eichmann in Argentina in 1960 and his trial and execution in Israel in 1961 and 62 for his role in organizing the mass murder of Jews, as well as for crimes against Poles, Slovenes, and Roma people. For a while, these events captured the attention of the Jewish and non-Jewish public globally. They provided the context in which a coalition of Jewish organizations transformed Holocaust commemoration in London. In 1960, diverse organizations that had previously organized separate memorial events joined together, and they were now joined by the Board of Deputies of British Jews and by a dozen smaller associations, mostly associations of survivors. By 1961, the consolidated commemoration presented a contrast to the disjointed and insular gatherings of the previous decade. The memorial event itself would now take place in a West End venue, usually a theatre that could accommodate up to 2,000 people. The occasions were marked by displays of martial and religious solemnity, a procession of the Association of Jewish Ex-Servicemen and Women, standard bearers, the beat of drummers from the Jewish Lads Brigade, the lighting of 6 memorial candles, one for each of the 6 million murdered. The London male Jewish voice choir sang Zog nit kein Mol, never say, an anthem of defiance and hope, inspired by the revolt in Warsaw, composed in the film The Ghetto, and adopted. There were commemorative prayers and Kaddish, a prayer associated not only, but especially with mourning. Much of the audience at these events comprised Jewish survivors and their families. Now, however, commemoration also addressed the non-Jewish world, whose interest had been aroused by Eichmann's capture and trial. Speakers at these events included eminent non-Jews, as well as Jewish leaders. In 1962, David Astor, the editor of the Observer newspaper, delivered the main address. He set out his universalist and redemptive understanding of the significance of what he called the Nazi persecution of European Jewry. Nazi anti-Semitism, he said, was a manifestation of man's capacity to destroy his fellow beings without rational motive. Astor's universalism was thoroughgoing. The fate of the Jews under Nazi rule should be studied, he proposed, as one example, albeit by far the worst, of a widespread human phenomenon. This required study, he argued, in order to raise awareness of these dangerous latent tendencies. Astor called for the establishment of a center of what might be called, he said, political psychopathology. This would be a worthy monument to the 6 million murdered Jews. And 4 years later, he helped establish the Columbus Center at the University of Sussex, led by Norman Cohen. The center bore a close resemblance to this prototype. In 1965, When the Labour government began to legislate against racial discrimination, the universalist interpretation of Nazi persecution acquired a more precise political form. Elwyn Jones, the Attorney General, who had been part of the prosecuting team at Nuremberg, reflected that it was not only the honor of Jewish people that had been vindicated in the Warsaw Ghetto uprising, it was the dignity of man himself, regardless of race or color or creed. This was a pointed statement uttered shortly before the second reading in Parliament of the government's first race relations bill. Legislation intended to prohibit race discrimination in public places and which designated incitement to racial hatred as a crime. Speaking the following year, Reg Friesen, the Jewish Labour MP for Willesden East, yoked Jewish resistance to the Third Reich to what he conceived as the obligation of Jewish people to resist racial prejudice in the present. When a fascist thug hits a coloured man, he said, he hits a Jew. In the early and mid-1960s then, the Warsaw Ghetto remained at the centre of Holocaust memorialization, but memorialization had changed. It now addressed non-Jews as well as Jews. It was not only about mourning and Jewish martyrdom, but it was also forward-looking. And it was intended to promote a world that was not only free from anti-Semitism, but also free from race prejudice and discrimination. Despite these changes, the path that leads from Holocaust commemoration in the mid-1960s to the present is a crooked one. Even in the early 1960s, commemoration events did not speak with a single voice. There was a gulf between the visions articulated by Astor and Elwyn Jones and the words employed in 1964 by Mr. D. Kupferman, chairman of the Polish Jewish Ex-Servicemen's Association. Rather than look to a better future, Kupferman's focus remained on the past and the blame which belonged, he said, to the whole German nation for helping to exterminate 6 million Jews. In 1966, Mr. Veit, the vice chairman of the association, reflected, "We cannot forget the murder of our fathers and mothers, brothers and sisters, the murder of our own flesh and blood. For many survivors, this was specifically a Polish Jewish event and a moment for irreparable grief." Universalism proved a fragile ideal and was further dented by the war in June 1967 between Israel and Egypt, Syria, and Jordan. In the aftermath, Jewish minorities in Poland and Iraq were victims of state persecution. There was also a surge of Zionist sentiment and pride among many Jews in Britain. Events held to commemorate the Warsaw Uprising reflected these developments. In 1968, the Polish ambassador did not receive an invitation. The president of the Board of Deputies, Alderman Michael Fidler, who would soon become a Conservative MP, eschewed the language of progressive universalism. Instead, his words were defensive and particularist. He called on British Jewry not to remain silent in the face of the threat to Israel's security or in the face of persecution of Jewish communities in foreign lands. In the 1970s, not only was the universalist impulse in retreat, but Holocaust commemoration in Britain appeared to be a specifically Jewish vocation. In 1979, when the Board of Deputies asked Mrs. Thatcher's Conservative government for permission to erect a Holocaust memorial close to the cenotaph, they received a chilly response. As the question was discussed in Cabinet over the following years, the strongest objections came from the Foreign Secretary, Lord Carrington, who saw no reason why land owned by the Crown should be used to memorialise events which did not take place on British territory and which had not involved a large part of the British population. In other words, as late as the 1980s, so far as the British government was concerned, Holocaust memorialization was not part of the national story, and it had no universal meaning. Yet, 2 decades later, in the early 21st century, Holocaust memorialization formed a rare point of consensus in Britain's fracturing political culture. In 2001, the Blair-led Labour government declared the first UK Holocaust Memorial Day. In 2014, the Conservative Prime Minister David Cameron, with cross-party support, established a Holocaust Commission to ensure that the memory and the lessons of the Holocaust are never forgotten, and the legacy of the survivors lives on for generation after generation. The report also declared that, I quote, ensuring that the memory and the lessons of the Holocaust are never forgotten lies at the heart of Britain's values as a nation. How then did we travel from the indifference of the 1980s to the status given to Holocaust Memorial Day in the 21st century? And related to this, why did Holocaust commemoration and consciousness acquire a prominence and content as well as a prominence so different from what we have seen in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s? I want to begin with the new emphases and new patterns. So these are the questions I'll address next. Before doing so, though, let me add that although today the UK has become a world leader promoting Holocaust commemoration, the country arrived late to the project relative to some other countries. For this reason, the shape of commemoration in the UK was strongly influenced by tendencies which first developed elsewhere. I want to highlight 3 interrelated transnational developments which transformed the whole content of Holocaust commemoration and consciousness in the UK. One of these concerns the shift from Warsaw to Auschwitz as the focus for commemoration. The United States made miniseries screened by the BBC in September 1978. The United States miniseries Holocaust, screened by the BBC in September 1978, was both a symptom and a motor of this change. A global media event starring Meryl Streep, among others, the series tells the story of a fictional Jewish family, Joseph Weiss, a successful Berlin doctor, and his wife and children. It charts their journey from bourgeois affluence to the gas chambers. A parallel story focuses on Erich Dorf, an unemployed lawyer who enrolls in the SS and becomes an agent of the Nazi war against the Jews. Auschwitz is the terminus for both of these fictional narratives. Over the next 2 decades, the place of Auschwitz in the Holocaust narrative was consolidated by historians writing in English, such as Martin Gilbert, Robert Jan van Pelt, and Deborah Dwork, and by influential social theorists, notably by Zygmunt Bauman, who argued that the mass production of death at Auschwitz was an encapsulation of the dark side, even perhaps the essence of modernity. When Holocaust Memorial Day was inaugurated in Britain, it was the liberation of Auschwitz, not the Warsaw Revolt, that was chosen for the commemorative date. A second development in the 1980s and 90s concerns the authority of survivors and their testimony. This was a process that was driven in large part by the Romanian-born Holocaust survivor and Nobel laureate Elie Wiesel. In 1944, at the age of 15, Wiesel was deported to Auschwitz. He survived. In 1956, he published a memoir in Yiddish, Und die Welt hat geschwiegen, and the world was silent. It described Wiesel's experiences during the Holocaust. The memoir was republished in French in 1958, in English in 1960, but now without its original accusatory title. The book was repackaged as La Nuit, or Night. From this time, Wiesel repeatedly expressed the idea that the Holocaust is an unknowable event beyond representation. It transcends history, he argued. Auschwitz, he wrote in 1975, defies literature as it defies all systems. Its truth remained hidden in ashes. The Holocaust, Wiesel maintained, was a sacred event, akin to the revelation at Sinai. If the Holocaust was sacred and beyond representation by historians, social scientists, and novelists, then, as Tony Lerman and Zoe Waxman have argued, all that remained is for survivors to bear witness. Their testimony acquires a transcendent character. It provides access to a sacred mystery which otherwise eludes anyone who did not themselves experience the horror and survive. Wiesel made these claims in the 1960s and 70s, but it was only in the 80s and still more in the 1990s that they took institutional form. It was from this moment that survivor witnesses were called upon to authenticate the past. At the end of the 20th century, there was an efflorescence of projects designed to capture the testimony of Holocaust survivors. More than this, henceforth, survivor testimony became a fulcrum of Holocaust memorialization. In part, this development was related to the new focus on Auschwitz. As those of you who have visited Auschwitz-Birkenau will know, the place was a vast complex. It was a labor camp as well as a death factory. And as a result, there were many more Holocaust survivors from Auschwitz than there were from those camps devoted solely to murder, and more than from Warsaw. One testimony gathering initiative was the Fortunoff Archive in New Haven, Connecticut. It began in 1979 as a project videotaping Holocaust survivors who were allowed to structure and tell their own stories. It had collected 3,600 testimonies by 1995 and was now housed at Yale. The Survivors of the Shoah Visual Foundation, launched in 1995 by Steven Spielberg, has followed a different path. Here, the interviews are highly structured, and the explicit goal of the foundation is didactic. In this case, testimony is intended to teach racial, ethnic, and cultural tolerance and provide a resource with which to resist anti-Semitism. We can see here the imprint of different influences. In part, they reflect the democratization of history writing and research, reflected, for example, in the rise of oral history. At the Fortunoff Archive, therapeutic approaches to testimony have been influential. The benefits of testimony are seen to accrue to the survivors themselves, as well as to posterity. However, as the Spielberg Initiative suggests, for some influential figures, survivor testimony was now invested with a pedagogic function, fueled by the conviction that the Holocaust was a terrible mystery which could only be apprehended through an account with a survivor, through an encounter with a survivor. And growing numbers believed that this encounter could make the world a better and safer place. The third and related change in the late 20th century was that the words Holocaust and Shoah became commonplace as the terms employed to describe Nazi Germany's war against the Jews. The rise of the use of the word Holocaust, capitalized, began in the 1960s, spurred by Wiesel's memoir and the Eichmann trial. And you can see from this Google engram how usage of the term took off in the 1980s and 1990s. The United States Holocaust Memorial Museum opened in 1993. In 2000, the Imperial War Museum in London opened its own dedicated Holocaust exhibition. In the United States, in 1962, there was just one university course taught on the Holocaust. By 1995, there were over 100 institutions in the US devoted to study the Holocaust. The Holocaust was now well and truly established as a discrete unit of history. The term Shoah, meaning disaster or ruin in Hebrew, originates in the Bible and was a word used in the Hebrew press in Palestine in the 1930s to describe events in Germany. However, as a synonym for the Holocaust, the word was popularized by Claude Lanzmann, whose film Shoah appeared in 1985. By 1985, the term Holocaust had been extended to apply to the persecutions of victims of the Nazis other than Jews, Roma and Sinti, homosexuals, people with disabilities. Using the Hebrew term Shoah, Lanzmann pushed back against this tendency. He chose the Hebrew term because he wanted to emphasize what he conceived as the singular fate of Jewish people under Nazi rule, a fate that could not be represented in language. In words that might have been uttered by Wiesel, Lanzmann explains himself as follows: how could there be a name for something that was utterly without precedent in the history of mankind? The word Shoah occurred to me one night because, not speaking Hebrew, Shoah was a signifier with no signifying, a brief, opaque utterance, an impenetrable, unbreakable word. And here we see the takeoff of the word Shoah to describe the Holocaust, again in a Google engram, in the late 20th century. Holocaust consciousness came late into the United Kingdom, but when it did arrive, it was in a blaze of activity. After the election of 1997, the Labour government, headed by Tony Blair, called for a renewal of citizenship at home. New Labour came to believe the Holocaust should play a central role in civic education. And it was in this context that the government introduced Holocaust Memorial Day in 2001. This focus on the Holocaust was in part an outgrowth of work undertaken by the Task Force for International Cooperation on Holocaust Education, Remembrance and Research, created in 1998 on the initiative of the Swedish Prime Minister Göran Persson, with the support of Bill Clinton and Tony Blair. The task force was an initiative from centrist political leaders in the aftermath of the Cold War. After the collapse of the Soviet Union and other communist states, and in the wake of German reunification, Holocaust memory played a strategic role in the ideological reconstruction of West European democracy and in the conception of a new unified Europe. In 2004, Romano Prodi, then president of the European Commission, stated, "The horror of the Shoah deeply marked Europe's founding fathers." In fact, the 1957 Treaty of Rome, the EU's founding document, made no mention of the annihilation of Europe's Jews. But in this case, it is Prodi's rewriting of history that matters. The Holocaust and the defeat of Nazi Germany had become the foundational event from which democratic Europe drew legitimacy. Within the international task force, it was Britain which brought forward the proposal to designate a day of remembrance for Holocaust victims. Blair declared, "The Holocaust deserves a permanent place in our collective memory." When Holocaust Memorial Day was introduced in 2001, an information pack was sent to all the schools in the country. The aim of the day, the pack explained, was not only to raise understanding and awareness of the Holocaust, but also, and I quote, to highlight the values of a tolerant and diverse society and the responsibility of all citizens. Holocaust Memorial Day also commemorates millions of non-Jewish victims of Nazi persecution and also some other genocides, those in Cambodia, Rwanda, Bosnia, and Darfur. In Britain, as in Europe, the fight against anti-Semitism was now imagined to guarantee human rights and toleration in the present, precisely because post-1945 democracies were built on the defeated ruins of Nazism. But what was being commemorated? Here the developments of the two previous decades powerfully infused the educational message. The information pack for schools to use on Holocaust Memorial Day did not dwell on the dangers of political power, but rather on the demands of citizenship. Jack Straw, the Home Secretary, explained, the lessons to be learned are for us all. David Cameron's Holocaust Commission in 2015 reproduced the same rationale for Holocaust commemoration. The prize, we are told, will be empathetic citizens with tolerance for the beliefs and cultures of others. The focus of attention is on individuals. This even applies to the Holocaust itself, which the Commission presented as a historic expression of unreason and popular prejudice. Ultimately, it opined a product of 1,000 years of European anti-Semitism. This is a bizarre and decontextualized rendition of the fate of Jews in the Second World War. To be sure, the Nazis' mass murder of Jews required the participation of tens of thousands and implicated millions. But we should not let slip that the final solution, as it was called, was fundamentally a state-driven project undertaken in circumstances of total war. The trio of developments I've set out, the focus on Auschwitz, on survivor testimony, and on the installation of the Holocaust as an event of unique moral and pedagogic significance, all feature centrally in the culture of Holocaust commemoration today. This was illustrated vividly a year ago by the Prime Minister. In January 2025, Keir Starmer not only put aside time to visit Auschwitz, but also hosted a special gathering of Holocaust survivors and their descendants at 10 Downing Street. Here we are told he spent time listening to the powerful testimonies of Holocaust survivors. The Prime Minister signed the Holocaust Education Trust Book of Commitment, promising to fight the poison of anti-Semitism and to support Holocaust education so we can not only tackle the root causes of this hatred, but also ensure that never again, means what it says. The Holocaust functions here as a moral marker that paradoxically is both unique and paradigmatic. The current emphases within Holocaust commemoration have had some regrettable consequences. First, they stand in the way of our capacity to properly remember the Holocaust. I've already mentioned the way in which the state slips out of the account, but also the attention we devote to Auschwitz comes at a cost to historical accuracy. 1 million were murdered at Auschwitz, but its symbolic stature obscures the fact that as many Jews were killed by bullets as by gas. By the end of 1941, the Germans, along with local allies, had slaughtered 1 million Jews in the Soviet Union and the Baltics. equal to the total number of Jews killed at Auschwitz during the entire war. The history of mass murder was less modern than we sometimes imagine. The status given to witnesses over the last 3 decades is also problematic. Wiesel wanted Holocaust survivors not only to have a voice, but to be heard. And in this respect, he was, of course, correct. And the attention we pay to testimony is salutary and important. The problem is not with testimony, but with a particular sort of sacred authority invested in it. After all, survivor testimony is necessarily mediated by post-war experiences and understanding, not least by the survivors' personal experiences and their post hoc understanding that what they lived through constitutes the Shoah or the Holocaust. Second, the content of memorialization too often promotes the mistaken view that by learning lessons from the Holocaust, we will be better able to overcome anti-Semitism and prejudice today. The persistence of anti-Semitism in Britain and the rest of the world presents a grave challenge, all the more so in the wake of killings in Manchester and Sydney. But there is no evidence that Holocaust education helps us understand and confront anti-Semitism today. The most recent academic synthesis of reputable evidence that we have, published last year, concludes that Holocaust education often fails in conveying knowledge of the Holocaust, much less civic and anti-racist outcomes. Believing otherwise is a form of magical thinking. There are good reasons why school pupils and students should learn about the Holocaust. But confronting anti-Semitism and racism in the present is not one of them. There is also great need for carefully thought out educational initiatives to combat anti-Semitism and racism. But Holocaust education is not the way to do it. The absence of the state from our understanding of the Holocaust stands in the way of connecting the history of the Holocaust to racism in the present. At the same time as the Cameron government advocated that we learn lessons from the Holocaust, the Home Office presided over the Windrush scandal, which saw thousands of law-abiding Black Britons from the Caribbean classified as illegal immigrants. An unknown number were denied access to paid work and housing. Scores were deported. The Windrush scandal underlines the continuing significance of the state as an agent of racial discrimination and disadvantage, something which the current practice of Holocaust memory serves to obscure. The mainstream consensus that adheres to Holocaust education and remembrance in the United Kingdom then comes with limitations, both as a form of understanding and commemoration about the past and as an influence on the present. I've also tried to demonstrate that the history of Holocaust consciousness and commemoration is also a history of change, and that this has been a contentious history. This emphasis on change and debate is helpful, I believe, as we contemplate Holocaust consciousness and commemoration in our present moment. The Holocaust was invoked repeatedly following the slaughter of civilians and hostage-taking perpetrated by Hamas and its allies on October the 7th, 2023. It was, said President Biden and many others, the deadliest day for Jews since the Holocaust. The Israeli ambassador to the UK, Tzipi Hotevli, labelled Hamas as the new Nazis. And in doing so, she repeated language used by Benjamin Netanyahu. These statements draw strength from the emphases and shortcomings in Holocaust consciousness today, in which we approach Jewish suffering without attention to context, without attention to the exercise of state power that produced it. I'm sorry, I garbled that. I'll say that again. These statements from these political figures draw strength from emphases and shortcomings in Holocaust consciousness today, in which we approach Jewish suffering in the Holocaust without attention to the context, to the exercise of state power that produced suffering. The spree of murder, mutilation, and hostage-taking carried out by Hamas and others on October the 7th was heinous. These crimes were committed in circumstances in which the relationship of Jewish people to state power was entirely different to the one that led to the Holocaust. In Israel-Palestine, there is a history and a current practice of discrimination, displacement, and dispossession, in which Jewish people, on this occasion, are the beneficiaries. The invocations of the evils of Nazis and the Holocaust helps obscure this continuing process. It opens the way to saying that any response by Israel, however punitive, whatever its impact on a civilian population, can be justified. Arguably, invocations of the Holocaust, by presenting the Hamas attack as another existential threat, have been an enabling factor in Israel's war on Gaza. That catastrophic onslaught has produced tens of thousands of civilian deaths, displacement, disease, and privation. Israel and some of its leaders find themselves accused, though not convicted, of war crimes. Israel, the Jewish state itself, is accused, but not convicted, of genocide. Israel's former foreign minister, Shlomo Ben-Ami, also a historian, wrote in Haaretz in August last year that Israel is committing atrocities that may remain a mark of Cain on the forehead of the Jewish state for years to come. Is it possible, he asks, that the people who endured the Holocaust are now committing the most heinous of crimes, genocide against their neighbors? The accusation of genocide brought against Israel inevitably evokes the Holocaust, which is instated as the archetype of genocide. And this accusation is made by some eminent Holocaust historians, including Omer Bartov and Amos Goldberg. Other historians, of course, defend Israel's war on Gaza as a war of defense. And in this, they have been supported by Danny Dayan, the chair of Yad Vashem, and by Stuart Eisenstadt, the chair of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, the two most significant institutions in the world dedicated to Holocaust memory. For these reasons, debate over Israel's war on Gaza impinges powerfully on Holocaust consciousness and commemoration. Sometimes intimately so. As some of you may know, last month, a worker with the Holocaust Memorial Day Trust in Scotland had her contract of work terminated on account of her active support for Standing Together, a grassroots movement organizing Jewish and Palestinian citizens of Israel against the occupation and for peace, equality, and social justice. The reason given for the dismissal is that Standing Together has accused Israel of committing genocide in Gaza. Her stance reflects wider efforts to connect Holocaust memorialization to a broad understanding of what never again should mean. Wider efforts by activists. Cognate work is undertaken by scholars such as Brian Chayet, Ezra Ozurek, and Michael Rothberg, each of whom in different ways explores connections between Holocaust memory, anti-colonial and anti-racist struggles, and movements for civil rights. Today, there is no consensus over what our purpose is or should be when we remember the Holocaust. As we have seen, the meaning of the Holocaust and how we should respond to it was a contentious subject from the very beginning. This contention was present in responses to the Warsaw Ghetto revolt. In the past, as today, there is a tension between universal and particular understandings of the fate of Jewish people at the hands of the Nazis and their allies. Today, it seems to me, our disagreements over what never again means are irresoluble. They present a clash of values and a clash of principles. They illustrate how history writing and memorialization is a conversation between the past and the present, in which the present will always have the last word. Nevertheless, our disagreements are connected to the past and to the debates of those who have gone before us. We can at least say of our disagreements that they honor the past, and in the context of Holocaust Memorial Day, that may just be enough. Thank you.
Thank you. For the IHR, this collaboration is one of our most important, and it has been an absolute privilege to think with you, David, tonight. An absolute privilege, so thank you. I think your careful attention to all of the things that historians do, thinking with evidence, thinking about change over time, contextualizing, to think about the work that memorialization has been called on to do, the work that it cannot do, the work that it should do, all of which I think has just demonstrated why doing history matters, and why it matters now. I'm sure that there are lots of you here who would like to say something, would like to ask a question. We want to use this time for conversation. So we have 2 microphones, I think. And if you could raise your hands, brilliant, already raised. So we have a first question there, please. Oh, sorry, Jan. There, in front. Green, yes, green jumper.
That should be fine now. Try speaking into that.
We now have the enormous microphone. Enjoy.
I will. Can I lick it as well? Thank you for such an interesting lecture. One point that occurred to me, and I've never thought of it before, is the testimony given by the survivors spanned a relatively short period since the end of the Second World War, and it is now virtually over. Does that tend to suggest that maybe we have a select set of testimonies which might be different to what we would have had if everybody had been able to give testimony much earlier?
Okay, we'll hold that question. You've got that written down, haven't you? We're going to take a question there, the laptop.
Thank you. I was just wondering a little bit about, you spoke a bit about how Zionism used the Holocaust as a justification for the creation of Israel and kind of all of its actions today, and basically how the Holocaust kind of created like a collective European Jewish identity which wouldn't be felt in, I guess, Jewish communities in the Middle East and things like that. But I was just wondering how far British Jews identified with the memorialization of the Holocaust and its developments, and then maybe with Zionism as a result.
And can we take the question immediately behind as well?
Thank you. It's two parts, if I'm allowed. The first one, which way would you vote on Westminster. And why, of course, it's a longer answer. And the other thing is that I'm troubled just intuitively by hearing people talk about people shouldn't be bystanders, but the people who are told, which is usually, 14-year-olds, let's say, don't get any help in how to do that standing up safely and how to assess what it is that they're supposed to be intervening on. And I think that that's a really big problem that people are naively ignoring. I don't know if it's just me. Now take this thing away.
You okay? We've got 3 questions there, David.
Thank you. On the question of testimony, perhaps I'm less concerned than you are, or your question is, by the question of selectivity. In a sense, all survivor testimony is exceptional because most Jews did not survive. And in a sense, all historical evidence is only a fragment of what happened in the past. So what you describe is a more general problem. But something else sort of lies inside of your question, which I'll mention, which is, of course, the number of survivors left is diminishing. And one other sort of example of the sacralization of testimony is the attempts in some places to make up for that fact by having virtual survivors who are programmed to answer questions from visitors, not always in ways that actually answer the question. So that is it's not my problem, but it's a problem which others are facing now. Did British Jews identify with memorialization? I think from the 1960s onwards, they increasingly did. And although my closing remarks, especially, were sort of tied in memorialization to issues around Israel-Palestine, I don't want to give the impression that that was always the central issue. Something I didn't talk about, and I'm grateful to your question because it allows me to mention it, is that there was an extraordinary exhibition about the Warsaw Ghetto mounted in London, first in Bayswater in 1961 and then in Hackney in 1962. And what is striking is how support for this exhibition, for this very early exhibition, went very deep into the Jewish community. Funds were raised through selling advertising space in the exhibition booklet. And when I found this in the London Municipal Archives, it's not in the Greater London Record Office, or whatever that wonderful place in Clerkenwell is called, I was astonished to find my uncles, my great uncles among the people who had bought advertising space. They were not people who I recall as being particularly ardent in their Jewishness. And also, because the exhibition was mounted actually quite close to Notting Hill, where there had been race riots 3 years earlier, where Oswald Mosley had stood as a candidate in the 1959 election. There was security for the event. And again, security was provided by branches through London of people who were involved in the Association of Jewish ex-servicemen and women. So I take that as evidence that concern about memorialization among Jewish people was not only about Israel, not only about Zionism, and actually was quite widespread in the 1960s. And lastly, over Westminster, I think it's going to happen. I don't have a vote. I'm not particularly in favour of it, which is not to say I'm in any way against Holocaust education and Holocaust memorialization, but I am sceptical about why British governments want to commemorate someone else's atrocity. This country has plenty of atrocities of its own to remember, not least its own genocide in Tasmania. When David Cameron had his Holocaust Commission, I ended up giving some evidence to it. And although my views were not as formed as I hope they are this evening, I didn't really say what they wanted to hear. But as I left, one of the leading members of the commission said in exasperation, "But don't you think this should be a moment of national celebration?" And I think that discloses something about the driving force. Not the driving force for Jewish people, but the sort of ideological force behind the project. So I'm not in favour.
You're right, we'll take another 3. Oh gosh, there's so many. All right, please can we take the question at the front here first? And then we'll take you.
Yeah. A couple of comments and a question. My first encounters with Holocaust commemoration were with the Friends of Yiddish in the early 1980s, and it was really interesting to hear that history. But what struck me about the Friends of Yiddish commemorations, which were in the language of most of the victims, was that the person chairing those, a man called Meyer Bogdansky, a refugee after the Holocaust from Poland, he wrote this. He had this handwritten speech. He did one every year, new handwritten speech. But there were 3 consistent elements in it. One was honouring Roma gypsies, who he said died in the same way for the same reasons, which is very interesting in terms of how internally Jewish it was. Secondly, he railed against Holocaust deniers and downplayers. And thirdly, he railed against what he said was being taught in Israeli schools in the 1960s in particular, that Jews went like lambs to the slaughter. But in celebrating the resistance in the way they did, it wasn't just the physical resistance, it was very much the cultural resistance as well. The question I wanted to ask is, I would imagine from what you said that America has followed a similar trajectory to Britain in terms of the changes in the way. I wondered about the countries that were occupied by the Nazis, like France and Belgium, and whether you have knowledge of how, if there's been any similar trajectory, or is it different there?
Can we move the enormous microphone over there, please? Thanks, Karen.
Thank you. Thank you. I just wanted to say, well, I'll get to the question at the end. I'll try and be quick. But this brought to mind a book I read as a child called The Silver Sword, and I didn't realise it was written in 1956 and published in the UK. I would have read it about 2003 when I was 10, and that had such an impact on me, and that would have been through school that I found that. I still call my mum Mammy Zia to this day. It's just sprung to my mind. That's why I still call my mum that, because I picked up on the Polish in it. What do you think we should be doing instead, if you don't think the education angle is working? Because I hopefully am one of the people that came out of it a bit more empathetic. What should we as a society and the government be doing as well as, or instead?
How are you going to respond to the challenge in social media on Holocaust denial?
And actually, we'll take the question next door as well. We've got 4 questions to look at.
Thank you. You spoke about the seeming purposelessness of Holocaust memorialization nowadays. And I wonder whether you could say something about what actually leads the politicians to go for these Holocaust memorials and various acts which both Labour and Tory governments have gone through, which, as you showed, were not reflected by their politics. I mean, I hope you understand. I made my question clear. I'm interested to know how do such government policies to create Holocaust memorialization come about? Is there lobby work? Who is it by, etc.?
Okay.
Thank you. Right, 4 to go there.
Well, let me start at the end. I'm sure that there is lobby work, but I don't think that's very important. As we saw, as I explained in the lecture, in the early 1980s, lobby work was to no avail. The question is, why does this issue resonate now with the political class? And that's not something, well, I've tried to say something about the ways in which the post-Cold War world, Western democracies, required something other than anti-communism as their foundational legitimation. That which had been so important in their conception of themselves had been taken away. That coinciding with German reunification, which brought the legacy of the past absolutely to the front. And that the attempt to construct a new Europe encompassing East European states drove this process forward. I do not, although obviously I've tried to express skepticism, I don't mean that skepticism to imply that politicians are insincere. I just think that they're wrong. And that's, I think it's important because in these debates, in these arguments, accusations of insincerity fly around all the time. I don't doubt that Keir Starmer, David Cameron, Tony Blair care very deeply about Holocaust memory. I wish they cared more deeply about British history and the dark side of British history as well. How should we respond? How should I respond on social media to Holocaust denial? I don't think I'll be doing that any day soon. I'm not. I think the problem we face is less Holocaust denial than Holocaust indifference. It seems to me that that's what came out of the sort of dreadful exchange, which some of you might have seen with Nick Fuentes. I'm having I'm sorry? Yes, but also he had an interview with Piers Morgan, thank you, and there's one more name in which he trashed the family memory of... No. He trashed the family memory of Daniel Finkelstein. Exactly. So it seems to me that that indifference is the greatest problem that we face, and that there are two I already have a job, so but I would say that part of the problem of combating that is simply a political problem, and the emboldenment of the far right. This is part of what comes with it. One sees it perhaps in a different register, but in this country, with the unwillingness of Nigel Farage to apologise for what it seems many people say he said when he was at school. So I think indifference is a great problem, and in part it is a political problem. I think as well, part of the problem that we face is that we have been trying to make Holocaust education do the wrong sort of work. If only, I think, we've been trying to use it to make people into better citizens when they actually just informing them about the past would be enough. Which in a way comes to what should we teach? I think that one of the, I'll try to be brief, because at BISA, one of the things that we do is that we teach a course which is called Facing Antisemitism. We teach it to media organizations, trade unions, professional associations, and so forth. I think there are two really important components of anti-Semitism education. One is what we call the reservoir of anti-Semitism, a set of stereotypes and narratives about Jews that have accrued in our common culture over centuries. But the other point, and this is a point which is perhaps more relevant to what we're talking about this evening, is that most anti-Semitism, most of the harassment, discrimination that Jewish people experience over the years is not violent, has not been violent. Looking at the Holocaust will not help us to recognize anti-Semitism when we encounter it. And I would say part of the history of this country over the last decade has been people who see themselves as anti-racists being unable to see anti-Semitism when it's in front of them. And what about France and Belgium? I can't really tell you very much with any authority about that. What I will say is that the process of the acceleration of memorialization came from the United States, and there's a different history there. It happened earlier there. for reasons which I think are probably internal to the United States. And the other extremely particular history is from Germany, and the way in which it was a constant presence, but after German reunification, it was an inescapable presence.
Do we have two final questions, very succinct ones? Please, yes, there, where you are. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, there were two comments. First, I enjoyed the lecture, and I agree very much with your last points, that one reason that Britain and the US is so happy to commemorate the Holocaust is because they think it distracts from their own colonial atrocities. I mean, it's a good way of ignoring those and focusing on something they don't feel responsible for, where in fact both the US and Britain, like the rest of the Western world, behaved very badly in allowing very few adult Jews into the country despite the genocide that was going on in Germany. And secondly, it's never been easier to come across Holocaust survivors. I come across them every few weeks, and we'll see them again on Saturday, because there's always quite a number of them, both those remaining Holocaust survivors and descendants of Holocaust survivors are on every single march for a ceasefire in Palestine and an end to violence against Palestinians. So they are very, very present at the moment, but it is, the ones I encounter, of course, very much linked to hoping for and never again to all genocides, and they know that that does include what's happening at the moment in Israel, Palestine.
Thank you very much. Very interesting. I am one of the teachers who teaches about the Holocaust and do the Holocaust Memorial Day assemblies. I suppose my question is, we always used to have a thing, you never conflate Palestine to the Holocaust because it's a unique thing, you know, that was always the case. I'm now in a position where when I talk about genocides, I say tragically, there has been an increase in anti-Semitism. You can't explain Bondi Beach, you can't explain Manchester actually without talking about what the UN calls a genocide. I'm saying this is how I do it at school. This is how I get to say it at school. So I suppose my question is, A, what do you think about that? You've done it today. You've talked about modern politics, and this used to be a taboo with the Holocaust. And B, how particular or not do you see the Holocaust? I know that's a massive question and there are millions of books on it, but I'd like your take.
Well, let's take one final question. There, behind you, Jan. There you go.
Thanks very much, David. My question, maybe, it comes back from your universalism point, which I really did appreciate, particularly in the context of the discussion about Gaza, to a rather parochial point about Westminster. We have a series of governments who've been really invested in the memorialisation, as you talked about, made it a really main platform of discourse. And yet we hear Priti Patel talk about cultural Marxism. We heard, you talked about Theresa May's hostile environment and Windrush. Remember her speech, People from Nowhere, which I thought was a paraphrase of Hitler's Siemenswerk speech from 1933 in Berlin. We have Starmer and Cooper and their anti-migrant and anti-refugee rhetoric talking about an island of strangers. And I know Starmer apologised, but it really strikes me, you have a series of senior politicians deeply invested in this debate, and yet they're not even able to revise their speech writers' speeches. They don't have the historical knowledge to say, you can't say that. These are echoes of language which were turned directly against the Jewish people in Europe. And this is language we should no longer be using. And I wonder, what is going on in Westminster? Is it just because we've got a group of teenagers writing Prime Minister's speeches? Or is it actually that there is such a lack of knowledge about the history of the Holocaust, its origins, about Nazi Germany, about the language, about the term the rootless cosmopolitan that we got not from Hitler but from Stalin? We're a room full of rootless cosmopolitans. This language is, when I hear it, I feel it's directed not just at migrants, not just at asylum seekers, not just at black British citizens who were caught up in the Windrush scandal. I feel it's directed in a sense at us. So we have these people say, We are absolutely committed to memorialising the Holocaust, but using language that should be absolutely taboo. How do you think it's possible, David? Is it just ignorance on their part?
Okay, David, you have got 2 minutes to answer all the questions.
Thank you, Lynn. Yes, obviously people should go on a pro-Palestine march in order to meet a Holocaust survivor. I think your point about the United States, it might or might not be correct, but I think there are multiple contexts. I think that and this isn't just my idea, but the Holocaust miniseries came out, I think it was 2 years after Roots was shown in the United States. And I think a lot of it has to do with the growth of if you like, ethnic politics and ethnic pride in the United States as well. And actually Wiesel had a role in that as well. What should be taught? My notes are not adequate to the second question, and I'm not sure what. I'm sorry, I'm not going to be able to answer that because I've just lost the question. I'll conclude by answering the final question. My own view is that, I recognise what you talk about in a way, although I think it was Braverman, not Priti Patel, who spoke about cultural Marxism, and we see what's happened to her today. But I think really what you're talking about is the crisis of liberal democracy that we're living through. It's not the influence of the 30s, but the crisis of liberal democracy, which obviously is a global crisis, and the ways in which, not least over immigration policy, the rights which states once granted are now being taken away. And I would say that rather than some sort of powerful reach back to the 30s is where we should be aiming our gaze right now.
Thank you. Thank you to everybody here at Birkbeck, particularly Jan, for all the work in organising this. Thank you to you all for coming out in January to this lecture, for being such an active and questioning group of people. This lecture is always a real pleasure to be part of, and this year really has excelled itself. But finally, just to say, and another big thank you to David, and let's do